Welcome to episode 64 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month I had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Mark Sedgwick, who is a professor of Arab and Islamic Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. He is author of books such as Sufism, The Essentials, Against the Modern World, Anarchist Artist Sufi, The Politics, Painting, and Esotericism of Aguéli, and many more books. In this episode, Dr. Sedgwick discussed Islam, Sufism, Anarchism, Aguéli, and traditionalism. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle by a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
Are you tired of listening to Western experts talking how the world works?
Isn't it a portion of liberal analysis of the uprising makes you fall asleep?
Well, then check Elephant in the Room, an anarchist radio show from European Dresden, where we interview activists who are participating in struggles around the world.
Elephant in the Room is a proud member of Channel Zero Network. You can find our show on your favorite podcast platforms, CZN website, or somewhere on the internet.
From activists
for activists.
I was wondering if you could talk about a transformational moment when you started taking a more critical look at history and propaganda and how power systems work. And I know you had mentioned before that you were interested in different societies when you were young and you had visited the Soviet Union. Was this a transformational moment?
Yeah, it was, absolutely. I mean, it was actually the history classes that we did on the Russian Revolution, and I must have been, I don't know, 14, 15, something like that then. And then a few years later, as you say, we had this school trip to the Soviet Union. But possibly something else that fitted in with it is that at about the same period, my parents were living in Spain, and it was the Spain of the late years of General Franco. So I guess that way I had experience of three different systems of the UK in the 70s, 80s, of Franco's Spain in its mildest form. It had been quite different earlier on, obviously, and also then in the Soviet Union. And then, I mean, that was in some ways a preparation for later on when I moved to Egypt in 86, 87. And that, of course, was another completely different society. I mean, not just politically, but also religiously, and in terms of the importance that religion had for people, the role that religion played in people's lives. So that's quite a lot of moments I've given you.
Yeah. When you moved to Egypt, was that when you got more into the study of Islam and Sufism, or were you into that before doing that study?
No, I wasn't at all. I mean, before I'd focused really on European history, and when I was an undergraduate student, I did some courses on Latin American history. And I was especially interested in economic history, and I very nearly did a PhD in economic history. And I think that it was a good thing that I didn't, because I think I've had much more fun with intellectual history over the years. Yeah, no. So I just went. In fact, I went to Egypt initially on a private visit because a friend of mine was there. And one thing led to another, and I wound up teaching courses in freshman writing at the American University in Cairo whilst I was doing a PhD on the history of Sufism. So that's how that all came together very nicely.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Wanted to move into more on Aguéli. You've said that some Sufis are not interested in politics in your writings and speeches, and I was wondering how Aguéli kind of fit into this as an anarchist. I know he had a lot of contradictions which made him so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Aguéli was initially interested in art. That was his first real interest. But he was also interested in religion. he was connected to the Swedenborgian Church, and was therefore interested in Swedenborgian mysticism. And then I think it's really when he first moved to Paris, because of course he was a young Swedish painter, end of the 19th century. It's obligatory to go and study in Paris, and that's what he went and did. And I think it's when he moved to Paris that he first got interested into politics, because there was obviously an extremely active anarchist milieu in Paris at that period, and a lot of people in the artistic world were interested in anarchism. A lot of anarchists were interested in art. So it was probably inevitable that somebody like Aguéli would come into contact with the anarchist milieu and with anarchist ideas, and they really appealed to him, and that put him on a sort of 3 tracks that he followed for the rest of his life: a political track, an artistic track, and also a spiritual religious track. And at different periods in his life, the focus was more on one than on the other, but all of them were there throughout the rest of his life, and they all interacted with each other in very interesting ways.
Yes, definitely. There had been on his relationship between art and anarchism. It seemed to be in his writing, from what I was reading, that he really liked art because it rejected hegemony in kind of like an anarchist way too, and that art penetrates through hegemony and kind of a counterculture. Is that kind of how he tied into it once he got into Paris with writing and art? Or he even gave up painting for a while, right, to go to writing?
Yeah, I mean, he spent some years as working as an art critic rather than as an active painter. So there was an early painting period, and then there was a more of a writing period, and then there was actually a period when he wasn't even writing about art particularly any longer. He was writing about politics and Islam and so forth. And then in his final years, he got back to painting again. But no, I mean, the way that he saw them together, I think that's what you said is a fairly good summary of that. And of course, I think for all artists, there is art. Painting is an attempt to get beneath the surface of reality. And I mean, quite how people do that, whether people get beneath as they did in the Renaissance period, people try and get beneath the surface by looking at anatomy, which is a very sort of physical way of getting beneath the surface, but makes a big difference to the painting that results, or whether they're using political or spiritual ideas to get beneath the surface, because of course there's also this connection between art and spirituality. And for Aguéli, for example, the whole idea of light was extremely important. Both light, obviously, for a painter, and if you're going to go down and paint in Egypt where the light is so strong, which many painters did, not just him. So light is terribly important for a painter, but also in a spiritual sense, in a religious or metaphysical sense, light is also of great importance. And he was interested in how those two features fitted together.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, he wrote about how art or painting was a spiritual activity and used symbolism in his painting. And yeah, he talks about light so much. I was wondering how this also ties into the esotericism that he was interested in, such as the Theosophical Society.
Well, I mean, he was interested in the Theosophical Society. He was originally interested in Swedenborgianism, and then he was interested in Sufism. And all of these forms of esotericism have something in common. And they've got, one of the things they have in common is a metaphysical understanding of the structure of being, which relates our physical existence in this world in rather a Platonic fashion back to a world beyond this, a world of forms in Platonic terms, or there are also in more hysteric terms, people start talking about the world, soul, and the one, and an emanation from the one, and so forth. That's something that ties together all his various spiritual interests, and of course ties them together to light, because the idea of light for many esoteric traditions, the idea of light as something similar to the emanation from the one, from ultimate reality. It's a very effective metaphor. In some ways, it's so effective that it's almost more than a metaphor. But in the same way that light illuminates what we see in the world, light can also illuminate us internally, our spirits. And light is something that comes into this world, in a sense, from outside it. I mean, of course, in fact, it comes from the sun, which is part of this world. But in a certain sense, it's also outside this world. So this is similar to how this ultimate reality of the divine, or however you want to conceive of it, different people conceive of it differently. That how that functions on us human beings in this physical creation.
Nice, thank you. Appreciate that breakdown. So another thing that I saw some similarities with not just esotericism, but with anarchism and Aguéli was anti-colonialism. You write in your book on Sufism that resistance to colonialism encouraged a sympathetic approach to Islam, as so many of those suffering from the effects of colonialism were Muslim. There was also an anti-colonial aspect to the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, there was.
I was wondering if you could talk about those connections.
Yes. Okay. Well, the anti-colonial aspect of the Theosophical Society is quite well known and recognized as having been quite important. And of course, one of the ways that it started is that the two guiding spirits behind the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky and Cardinal Olcott, traveled from the US to British India to discover more about Indian religious practice, about Hinduism. And then they got interested in Buddhism and moved on to what is today Sri Lanka, where they sort of came out as Buddhists. Now, both of these areas are at that point part of the British Empire, and the empires are built partly on force and partly on magic and mirrors and smoke. And the idea of the cultural, civilizational superiority of the imperial power was quite an important one, and was challenged by these two guys from America. One of them, of course, actually originally from Russia, was challenged by these two guys going around the place and maintaining the superiority of the local cultures, the superiority of Hinduism and Buddhism. So, and then there were also all sorts of connections between people in India and also in Sri Lanka who were interested in reviving the local culture or strengthening the local culture, which was a form of nationalist resistance, which afterwards actually turned into some of the nationalist movements that played a crucial role in ending the imperial domination. So they are encouraging, they are participating in, and they are encouraging more of a culturally based anti-imperialism than an actually politically based anti-imperialism, but it certainly has political implications. So this is a reasonably well-known story, and the British were also aware of the problem at the time. They could see what was going on. But the sort of equivalent for the Muslim world, the equivalent for Islam, is certainly Aguéli, and is very little known, and I think deserves to be better known. Aguéli, of course, was just one person, whereas Olcott and Blavatsky were backed up with a large movement. A worldwide movement and all sorts of followers, which is why they were much higher profile than Aguéli ever was at the time. And they're also higher profile today. But we find this with Aguéli, but also with this slightly problematic twist to it, that Aguéli's own activism was financed by the Italians. And the Italians were at that point trying to present themselves as anti-imperialists, as friends of Islam, as enemies of the big bad guys of the British and the French and so on. But this Italian policy was actually an element in Italy's bigger foreign policy, which was quite imperialist. I mean, they went and, as we know, they went and invaded Libya. And, I mean, they also, of course, provided financial assistance and arms to a Sufi sheikh in what is now Saudi Arabia. In those days, it was North Yemen, and the border changed subsequently. And that guy used them in a sort of anti-imperial struggle of his own, but an anti-imperial struggle against the Ottoman Empire, not against the European empires. So, I mean, at this point, the whole thing becomes extremely complicated, and quite who are the good guys and the bad guys is really not at all easy to say.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my questions when I was reading your book on Aguéli that you edited. Yeah, it seemed he was doing the Egyptian newspaper, which was funded by the Italian government.
Yeah.
And like you said, they have colonial. They were imperial, as you said. And was it that the Italian imperialists, were they doing this in hopes of spiting English imperialists? Was that the
I mean, I think that we've got two big things behind what the Italians are trying to do. I mean, one of them is that after the Risorgimento, after the unification of Italy, Italy is a sort of latecomer on the European stage and wants to establish itself as, having the same status as the French and the British and the Germans, who, of course, also trying to establish themselves at that point. And Italy, like Germany, because they were a slightly late arrival, hadn't been able to grab anywhere during the earlier period of the grand grabs, or whatever one wants to call it. So they just like everybody needs an opera house and a national steamship line and so forth. I mean, there is a certain feeling in that period that to be a serious player, you need to have some colonies somewhere. But another one is simply geographical. I mean, Italy is incredibly close to North Africa, and as we're seeing today, with all these migrant boats setting off from North Africa, and where's the first place you reach is Italy. So there's a certain geographical logic in it as well, that Italy wanted to establish itself in areas which were strategically important to it.
Yeah,
The idea that they were trying to promote that their imperialism was completely different from the British and the French imperialism, I don't think I really buy it.
and then they had went on to invade Ethiopia after that, right? Too.
Yeah. And then, of course, you see it does. If you look at the map and see where Ethiopia is, and then they got interested in Somalia, and just across from there is Asir, which was the place where the Sufi Sheikh, Asir, the place that I mentioned before, which is now in the south of Saudi Arabia, and that's where the Sufi Sheikh they were getting interested in was located. So really, whatever they were saying to the Sufi, the fact of the matter is that they were doing some pretty hard calculations, looking at the waterways and where the waterways narrowed and where you could establish a chokehold over shipping and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for breaking down that history. Were the Theosophical Society weren't they involved with some other anarchists as well? I think I've read before that Blavatsky was friends with Emma Goldman, if that's correct.
I don't actually know about that. I mean, she was friends with a lot of people, so that's certainly quite possible. And the anarchist movement, as I said, was the Theosophical movement. Both movements, in fact, anarchist and Theosophical, they were pretty big movements, right? But they are in similar circles. I mean, if one is being progressive politically, one may find oneself with the anarchists, and if one's being progressive in religious terms, in spiritual terms, in fact, probably these people would mostly say, yes, spiritual, no, not religious, spiritual. Then one is going to end up with the Theosophists. So just like there was this overlap in Paris when I was talking about Aguéli earlier, just like there was this overlap between art and anarchism, there was also an overlap between art and theosophy, and in certain cases also between theosophy and anarchism.
Wow, thank you. I wanted to talk about Aguéli working with the Parisian anarchists and the propaganda of the deed, and this led to him being imprisoned in 1894, and then leading him to get into Islam, right, when he went to prison.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, in a very different way than it happens nowadays. I mean, you get guys who get into Islam nowadays when they get to prison because there are some Muslims in prison who have gone through a sort of prison conversion and being super religious, and then somebody meets them and thinks, "Oh my goodness, that's really impressive. That's cool, these guys." Because there weren't any Muslims in Paris in those days. I mean, perhaps a couple of somebody, the Moroccan consul or something like that. But I mean, there really wasn't a Muslim community. So the form in which he first encountered Islam was in written form and in the form of the Quran, which he was reading in prison. And it was after that he first traveled to Egypt after he was released. His interest in Islam took some years to develop, however. I mean, he didn't sort of read the Quran in his cell, get that out, go to Egypt and become Muslim. He went to Egypt and pecked it. And it wasn't, in fact, until later that he became Muslim. And then the first place he went was actually Sri Lanka. We're not really sure why. Wasn't an obvious destination for somebody from Paris, but that's the first place that he really met real live Muslims. And then he later went back to Egypt as a Muslim, and that's where he met some Sufis, especially Sheikh Al-Aish, who turned out to be very, very important for him, and through him for world history.
Thank you for opening that up. And he had went to prison for animal rights activism, right? Was that for shooting a bullfighter?
Exactly. And I mean, I think that the number of people who managed to get sent to prison twice for what we would nowadays call terrorism, in two different causes as well, because they've both got liberation in common, but the first time it was these anarchists in Paris who, as you say, were using propaganda of the deed and blowing up an awful lot of places, and the French government lost its cool completely, which is, of course, one of the things one's trying to achieve if one's using propaganda of the deed, right? One's trying to provoke the target into behaving badly. So they lost their cool, and they did mass arrests of anybody who seemed to be connected with this, including Aguéli. But really, there was the whole thing then turned into a farce, and everybody was released. And the evidence against Aguéli was basically who he'd been sharing an apartment with, and there was one letter in his handwriting which established that he was in contact with some other anarchists. But I mean, it really wasn't very impressive at all in terms of evidence. But the second occasion, when he shot the bullfighter, I mean, he drew a pistol, pointed it at somebody, pulled the trigger, and shot him. I mean, in the shoulder. Right? Didn't kill him, he shot him in the shoulder. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is really attempted murder. But somehow he got away with it. He said that he wasn't aiming at this bullfighter in particular. He was just aiming in the general direction of the bullfighter, which I think is a pretty weak defense, really. But I think the real point was that he was participating. There was a big public debate in France at that time about the introduction of Spanish-style bullfighting, because the French have their own tradition of bullfighting, but at least in recent centuries, the bull gets away at the end. So it's like horse racing, where the horse gets away at the end normally. But of course, in the Spanish version, the bull is killed. The bull does not leave the arena alive, except under very unusual circumstances. So there was a lot of public feeling against introducing a new form of the sport, which was both seen by many people as cruel and also was seen as foreign. And the fact that the bullfighter who got shot was a Spaniard, and the fact that he didn't even turn up at the trial because he'd decided to go back to Spain, this has all got something to do with the fact that Aguéli got off with a suspended sentence, rather than the rather more severe penalties that one can get for attempted murder, especially in those days.
Yeah, and his court testimony seemed really brazen too, where he said that he would have shot the audience if he had more ammo because they were implicated in watching this suffering too. Or the judge seemed to just appreciate his honesty and gave him probation.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's very. I mean, exactly. That's not something that would do much good in most courts, was it? It's very difficult because we've got the newspaper articles, we've got reports of what people said and so forth, and to try and reconstruct from that what the atmosphere was, to try and imagine what the atmosphere was in that courtroom and in the street outside it, because it was quite a famous trial at the time. Is very difficult, but he got away with it.
Yeah. I was wondering, was there any research you found that maybe they were easier on the trial, or because not to stir more anarchist, like antagonist feelings, due to, like, this was only 20 years after the Paris Commune, I think.
I haven't seen anything to that effect, and certainly, in the earlier case, and the mass arrests that he was caught up in, that nobody was worried about not stirring up more trouble at that point. No, I think in this case it was. I don't think that he wasn't self-identifying as an anarchist at that point. He was self-identifying, in effect, as an animal rights activist. And as far as I can remember, none of the reports that I've seen make the connection. This guy who's just been shooting bullfighters a few years ago was helping blow up restaurants. That connection wasn't made at all, which probably worked in his favor.
I wanted to go to 1904, and you had written that he had most likely termed, or the first use of Islamophobia,
yes,
and this was Aguéli.
Of course, these things, who first used the word is always interesting, but you then have to ask the question, well, what did they mean by it? And what is the significance of them using it? What Aguéli meant by it was the European tendency to dismiss Islam as a religion without even trying to understand it, which is certainly a tendency that one finds. And Aguéli was trying to argue against that. He was trying to say to people, look, guys, we have a great culture here. We have a great civilization. If you're interested in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and you feel respectful of those civilizations, well, this one, it's the same. You should be approaching it in the same way. Of course, Islamophobia today, although it's called Islamophobia, it tends to be Muslimophobia, and thereby gets a bit mixed up with racism. And if somebody spits at somebody who looks Muslim in the street, as happens quite a lot, is that racism? Is that Islamophobia? What's going on there? I don't know. But it's the focus, I think, nowadays is more on individual people, immigrants who are disliked. Whereas for Aguéli, the immigration hadn't happened, hadn't even started. Nobody was imagining it. And in fact, the transfer of populations was in the opposite direction. It was Europeans traveling to the Middle East, traveling to North Africa, sometimes as colonists. So he was focusing on the reception of the religion, or rather, perhaps the refusal to receive the religion, the willing blindness, the failure to think that there could be anything interesting there worth looking at.
My next question had to do with Aguéli's interest in language. He seemed like Paul Robeson in his regard to being obsessed and able to pick up languages, and the effect that this really had on Sufism and Islam, because didn't he do a lot of translations for the first time in French, was it?
Yeah, he did. There had been translations before, but they'd been sort of literary translations of poetry and so forth, which went into the literature section of people's interests. He's the first person really to do translations which were aimed at people who were interested in spirituality. Because the Theosophical Society, on the whole, there were some exceptions, but the Theosophical Society on the whole was not terribly interested in Sufism, possibly because actually it shared in some of that Islamophobia that Aguéli was writing about. No, he was a very talented linguist. I mean, obviously, starts off speaking Swedish, and then learns French. And his French is never perfect. There are occasional little mistakes in his letters when he's writing in French, but it's pretty good. And his Arabic, which is a lot harder for somebody who has a European language as their mother tongue, is a lot harder to learn. That's really pretty good as well. This was an impressive achievement, and it was an achievement that through these translations had a real impact.
I saw some mentions in the book about how Aguéli had met with Peter Kropotkin at the Anarchist Club in London. Do you have any background on
any details about that?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, I wish that more was known about that. Seemed interesting. I was wondering if you could talk about Aguéli and his comparisons of Islam and Taoism.
So, I mean, this is a fashionable thing at the time, and theosophy as well, seeing different religions as being fundamentally about the same thing, as being different ways of understanding the same phenomenon. And Aguéli has the same approach, the same understanding. And he also meets in Paris a guy called René Guénon, who is a sort of full-time writer on esotericism, who has the same sort of idea. And Guénon has a small journal. It's a very small journal. I have no idea how many copies it sold, but it didn't last very long, and it looks a bit marginal. But he and Aguéli and another guy called Pouvorville were writing in this little journal and developing ideas in this little journal about mysticism, about esotericism. So Pouvorville had been in Vietnam and knew something about Chinese religion, Taoism, and Aguéli from his time in Egypt and his studies in Egypt and the people in that knew quite a lot about Sufism and the whole esoteric philosophical tradition in Islam. And Guénon put these two together, these two men together. And Aguéli was in some ways responding to the articles by Pouvorville and finding these points in common between Sufism and Taoism, which, I mean, is the beginning of a long tradition. There's a guy in the 60s called Toshiko Izutsu, who's a Japanese, who does the same sort of thing the other way around, and publishes books in English and that in the 1980s. So this interest in how they fit together, how these mysticisms, if one wants to call it that, I mean, there isn't total agreement about what one means by that term, but I think it'll do fine for now, that they clearly do relate to each other in certain ways. So how do they relate? And trying to explore this relationship and the commonalities is something which is still interesting people today. But the significance of that was not immediate, because this little journal, it fell to pieces, and in the last issues it's just Guénon and Aguéli writing all the articles, because why, everybody else has gone away, whether there was a row or they decided it was a waste of time if they're only selling 10 copies, I have no idea. But anyhow, the last editions are just Guénon and Aguéli, and then that journal stops, and Aguéli leaves France. He goes back to Egypt, and then he's expelled from Egypt, and he dies in Spain during the First World War. And after the First World War has ended, Guénon restarts a similar journal, which carries on publication until the 1960s, and then that journal, Guénon's died, but by then that journal then splits, and there's an English language one published in the US, and there's a French language one published by a slightly different group. Anyhow, so this is not a minor journal at all that's launched after the First World War. It's read by a lot of people. It has a really big impact in worldwide on understandings of religion and esotericism. Most all, one very minor exception, nearly all of Aguéli's pre-war articles are republished in this post-war journal. And the whole approach of this post-war journal, which is in effect run by Guénon, really shows the impact of Aguéli's understandings, of Aguéli's experiences with Sufism, of Aguéli's approaches to religion. So even though Aguéli's by then been dead for 10 years, he died young. Yeah, so I mean, this often happens, right? That the importance of somebody's work only becomes apparent years after they've died. So they never knew.
Yeah.
Aguéli stuck in Spain during the First World War, no money to buy food, trying to sort of painting on little bits of wood because he couldn't afford anything bigger. Pretty miserable, and going deaf, poor man. We don't actually know how. We know he was run over by a train. There is a possibility that he actually threw himself in front of the train. We don't know. I've tried to find the police report. There must be a police report, but nobody knows where it would be if it still exists. There are about 8 different archives run by 8 different departments, including the army, because the army was in charge of the police at some point and got there out. Anyhow, I've never managed to find that report. I think he was not a happy man at the time of his death, and if we could sort of tell him, relax, your work, your painting is going to wind up in museums, and the ideas in your writing are going to have a really big impact on people in a certain world, the people who are interested in esotericism and so on. It would have been nice to tell him that. And by the way, here's some money, buy yourself a square meal. You look like you need it. We can't do that, can we?
No, and his body was returned back to Sweden, though, right? But he wasn't given a Muslim burial or listed as his name, Abdul Hadi.
Yeah, no, he was initially buried in Spain, and at some point, I cannot quite remember when, I think it was the 70s or 80s, his body was taken back to his birthplace, Sale in Sweden, with the gravestone that it had there in Spain. And the gravestone, he was buried outside the major church in this town where he'd been born, with a completely Christian-looking gravestone. And occasionally people have thought, this isn't quite right. He needs something that he would have recognized. And Sala, the town, is not terribly easy to get to, but people do go there occasionally, and some Swedish Muslims know this history. So people occasionally say an Islamic prayer over his grave. So at least he's getting that, even if he isn't getting the right sort of gravestone.
Now, for the last part of the interview, wanted to go into traditionalism a little bit. Aguéli identified with the Malamataya, and he told Guénon that he was inspired by the Milan or Malamati path.
Yeah.
And traditionalism is not always known for being liberal and democratic, but this path was described as that. Can you break that open more?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I haven't come across that combination before. But it's a very sensible question. The first question, though, is quite how liberal is the Malamate or the Malamati path, and is it liberal or is it just resisting and rejecting norms? Because that is part of a spiritual path. And I mean, the logic behind the Malamateo and the Malamati path goes as follows. And this is what I'm about to say is something that I think most Sufis would recognize and agree with. What we are trying to do on the Sufi path is subject our lower animal self, gain control over our lower animal self, so that our higher divine nature is liberated from the things of this existence. And that's a position that many mystical traditions, not just Sufism, would recognize. There are various obstacles when one tries to do this. And one of the obstacles is that people look at one and say, oh my goodness, what a marvelous person that is. Because the admiration of other people is precisely the sort of thing that makes the nafs, as Sufis say, the lower animal self, that puffs it up. Oh, I am such a marvelous person. And I mean, it's also, it's the idea of why you are doing a prayer or a good deed or something like that. If I'm doing a prayer because I want the admiration of other people, then I may well get the admiration of the other people, but I'm not going to get any other benefit from it at all. One approach to solving this is the Malamati approach, which is to make sure that the outside world is not going to look at you and say, oh my goodness, what a marvelous person. And this is either achieved, this can be achieved by keeping one's good deeds completely private and secret, which other Sufis do as well. But it can also be by deliberately attracting people's disapproval. Now, if I'm going off to the mosque to spend the night praying and staying awake and reflecting on the transcendent, if I carry a can of beer with me as I'm going along the street, nobody is going to say, oh my goodness, what about this person? Now, once I get to the mosque, I'm probably actually not going to drink the beer because that's not going to help my night vigil at all. And I'm probably, because, I know that beer isn't actually a good thing, I'm probably just going to tip it away down the drain. But whatever. I've achieved the effect there. So whether the Mennonites are actually being liberal, or whether they are using a spiritual method, following a spiritual practice, which is actually quite a difficult one, can be discussed. But anyhow, okay, that's the Mennonites. Traditionalists, as you say, are not known for their liberalism. And of course, we have two varieties of traditionalists. We have political traditionalists, and the most famous here is Evola, who is the guy who said that Mussolini was too left-wing. Can you be to the right of Mussolini and still be liberal about certain things? About certain things. I mean, not about the political system that he thought. Not about the need for a divinely ordained hierarchical political system, but about degrees of human behavior. In a sense, you can trace some sort of liberal attitudes with Evelyn. But, I mean, on the whole, even if we're looking at Sufi traditionalists, people who've been brought to Sufism by the writings of Guénon, and who have possibly also read Aguéli's writings, that in the republished form, they are not generally politically liberal because they're very critical of modernity, and they regard liberalism as a sort of modern mistake. They think that there is a correct way of living, and different approaches are not all equally valid. That it's better, whether or not you're carrying a can of beer or just taking the bus, it's better to spend your evenings doing vigil in the mosque than gambling on an online platform. But if we think of the opposite of liberal as being conformist, which in some ways it is, these guys aren't really conformists.
Okay.
Or at least they are conforming to their own picture, their own understanding of the proper way to live, not to a sort of hegemonic understanding.
Thank you for breaking that down. That was really interesting. Thank you.
That's a really good question. I hope I'll still agree with what I said when I think about it later, but that's what I can do for the time being.
No, you did. There's big terms there, and liberalism obviously has changed over times and still interpreted differently. Speaking of Evola, he had. So some of the traditionalists, the political movement has become right wing. Since you've mentioned, like Steve Bannon has been a follower of Evola, and Bolsonaro's one of Bolsonaro's advisor, people in Hungary, France, Russia, and Bannon connected to Trump. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that, of being into the far right. But then I was also interested in the Orden Nuevo, by a far right group started by Evola, and they had planted bombs in 1969 and blamed it on the anarchist group 22 Marzo, which led to an anarchist being thrown out of a window, which led to the play Death of an Anarchist.
Exactly. I couldn't believe it because I'd seen Death of an Anarchist when I was a student. It was super popular in those days. And when I realized that the guy was there because of this Ordine Nuovo provocation, and the Evola was behind it. I mean, the way that things catch up with one in life, and one has absolutely no idea, and here it comes. Yes, but the question was.
My question was how traditionalism, this political turn, has really led to bolstering these right-wing movements.
Yeah, Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I mean, here, we talked about liberalism, and there are some big issues also with what we mean by right wing. And you mentioned Russia, and the leading guy in Russia, possibly actually worldwide nowadays in terms of this ideology, is Alexander Dugin. Now, he has been described as all sorts of things. Typically, he's described as fascist or neo-fascist. And I was editing a collection of essays, and one of the essays, not written by me, one of the essays was about him. So I thought, well, better let the guy have a chance to comment on it before it gets published. And this article kept describing him as a fascist. And his response was, look, I have written extensively about fascism. If you want to know my views on fascism, they're there, read them. And, don't call me a fascist. I don't call myself a fascist. I think that fascism is something that existed, got a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong. I am not a fascist, he says. So, I mean, is he a fascist? I don't know. I think actually, if somebody in their own terms says, as he does, says that he draws on and distances himself from both fascism and Leninism, and he's written a lot of books developing this idea, probably we have to take him at his own estimation, actually. With Bannon as a somewhat different case, because Bannon isn't, well, I was going to say Bannon isn't an intellectual. He is an intellectual. It's Trump who one can't really say is an intellectual. Bannon is an intellectual of sorts, but he's an activist rather than he does things. He organizes things rather than writing things. So it's a tiny bit difficult to place him because we don't have the writings, we don't have the points where he said, my position is this, my position is for the guy who inspired Bolsonaro and had quite a big impact in Brazil and is still having an impact in Brazil, in fact. What one gets out of him, this is Olavo de Carvalho, it was called, he died recently of COVID. What he takes out of traditionalism is above all the critique of modernity. At an earlier stage in his life, he had he'd accepted the whole package, and he'd actually become a Sufi and had run a little Sufi group in Brazil, which became slightly embarrassing for him when he later reinvented himself as a leading Catholic intellectual. The fact that this leading Catholic intellectual had actually converted to Islam earlier on in his life is something that he didn't really emphasize. But no, I mean, he ends up emphasizing and using the critique of modernity, which becomes a critique of liberalism. And what do we mean by liberalism here? Well, what does he mean by liberalism? What he means by liberalism, or what he meant by liberalism, is the apparently hegemonic liberal views about gender, about sexuality, about all these topics, which for people in the university world, for example, are generally fairly uncontroversial. And are in need of defending and promoting and so forth, and which for some people are really not that self-evident at all. So that's the sort of liberalism that Carvalho railed against. And that is an aspect of the right today this critique of liberalism, this critique of what they see as hegemonic liberalism, hegemonic globalized liberalism. And that's a really important trend today. And traditionalism fits with that in certain ways. But it doesn't really send people to night vigils in the mosque or anywhere else.
Thank you for breaking that open. Do you have time for one last question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I have one question that you just made me think about, and this is traditionalism, and it seems to be in that form, which you're talking about, this political form that's critiquing liberalism. It seems to be very like anachronistic because they seem to be against notions of equality, but empire was based on non-equality, and they seem to want to go back to an earlier colonialism or empire. But I was wondering, do they want to go back to like a paganism? Like, are they going back to something that's Eurocentric? Because if you look at indigenous cultures, they had multiple genders, such as the Kanaka Maoli. In North American indigenous cultures, there was different sexualities. And I see a lot of them describing this as wokeness now, but these are actually really old traditions that seem to have been normalized by colonialism.
Okay, so they want to go back an awful long way. I mean, sometimes when we think of conservatism or the right or something, you know, we imagine people who want to go back to the 1950s or to a certain picture of the 1950s, where, you know, women are all in black and white and wearing nice dresses and going in and out of their suburban house or something like that, right? Or we think of people who want to go back to perhaps to 1900 or something like that. These guys think that it all went wrong at the Renaissance. Not interested in going back to the 1950s. They want to go back to the 1250s. And indeed, as you say, some of them want to go back to before Christianity and are pagans. Evola was a pagan. Evola was extremely critical of Christianity and wanted to revive a certain sort of paganism, which of course makes slightly more sense if you're in Italy, where, you know, the Roman religion that we're all quite familiar with is of course a form of paganism. So they want to go back an awful long way. They tend to go for understandings and practices that are documented. They are very suspicious of things like Wicca, which is of course a sort of paganism, right? Where people are trying to reconstruct a tradition that's really been lost. So what they are coming up with is good enough for their purposes, but, you know, if we did some rigorous source criticism, certain questions would be raised. So this has been one issue with Native American religion. They have periodically got interested in Native American religion, and Sean, one of the most important traditionalist Sufis, got very interested in Sioux religious practices, because of course, although that isn't documented, there were still guys around who it's still a living tradition, or it seemed to him, I'm not sure, this isn't my field at all, seemed to him to be a living tradition, to the extent you can go and talk to people. Now, you mentioned as an example, non-standard sexualities. These guys, you know, they don't want to go back to the 1950s. Non-standard sexualities were not acceptable in the 1950s. In the 1250s, in 750 BC, you know, the ancient Greeks. So they're not, you know, they don't have this sort of what some people would call what Evola himself would call a petty bourgeois morality. They're not interested in petty bourgeois morality. And one of Evolar's best-selling books, I think myself, one of his less good books, is called The Metaphysics of Sex. And, frankly, I have a suspicion that he was running out of money and he needed to write something that was going to sell quite a lot. So I think he was being deliberately appealing to general interest in sexual practices. But he's exploring an awful lot. I mean, he himself absolutely did not have a sort of standard 1950s attitude to sex. And he was very interested in the work of Otto Weininger, who's sort of early Vienna, slightly before Freud, who develops some very interesting ideas about sexuality and bisexuality. Basically, I mean, he was arguing that all of us are partly male and partly female, and that you can have a very male man or a somewhat female man, or et cetera, and exploring ideas like that. And Evolar really liked these. So, absolutely not the 1950s.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. That helps me understand a little bit more where, they were coming from in that regard. I guess just to end, I was wondering what you're working on next and where people can find you, your work.
Well, what I'm currently working on is something very, very different, because one of the issues that concerns people very much in Europe at present is interethnic conflict. And I've been working on, and am working on a project looking at experiences of social deprivation amongst Muslims in Europe, and also trying to find out what the equivalent is for nationalists. And this one is quite a challenge, because there's lots of work on Muslims, most of it on what makes them radical or something like that. But there's far less work on the right. So that's the real challenge and the real interesting thing.
Oh wow!
But here I am, Aarhus University. Yep.
I bet there's a lot of new stuff to add now with all of the anti banning, like Palestinian protests in France and other places.
Oh my goodness! Yeah. I mean, I've shortly before that, I actually suggested that, fortunately not in writing, I actually suggested that that whole wave that had started with 9/11 was now over, and now we seem to find ourselves back in the post 9/11 period again.
It feels like 9/11 again with the propaganda. I saw a talk you did actually on 9/11 on YouTube, which is very interesting, about Bush. I really enjoyed that.
Good. I'm glad. That was years ago, so I'm glad somebody's still looking at that.
Oh, it was good, because I was in high school during 9/11, and the military had pretty much infiltrated our high school and tried to get the men to join. They were taking us out to lunch, buying us food, and getting us to sign up papers. Luckily, I said no.
You didn't sign.
I did not, no.
Could have been an interesting experience, but probably you made the right decision.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, well, Dr. Sedgwick, I want to really thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge and your experiences, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast. Thank you to Dr. Sedgwick for taking the time to speak with me. Please check out his work. Thank you to Awareness for the Music. And check out my friend Carla Joy Bergman's new podcast project with Jamie Lee Gonzalez and more, called On Belonging.